Namaste. Welcome to Invocation 2023. This year, the theme of the event is United India, inspired by the first dream of Sri Aurobindo. And as a part of convention series, we have every day a new topic to speak about and connect Sri Aurobindo's dream with the contemporary topics of India. And in that regard, today's topic is spiritual evolution of India, and we have Manoj Pavithran to give a talk on this subject. Manoj Pavithran is an integral yoga practitioner, coach, and founder of the Purnam Centre for Integrality in Auroville. He is passionate about helping young pioneers who are dreaming of creating a better world to integrate their spiritual calling with professional success. Manoj has authored a book, Pilgrims of the Infinite, in poetic prose expressing the essential journey of inner transformation. He has also made a film series called Evolution Fast Forward, presenting the vision and work of Sri Aurobindo, integral yoga, parts of the being, and the spiritual history of India in the light of Sri Aurobindo. So, we'll be listening to your talk, and perhaps once you're done, we can open up a little bit for the question and answer. Thank you. Over to you, Manoj.
Thank you, everyone, for taking your time out from this busy period, and that too in the afternoon. When I'm referring to the spiritual evolution of India, I'm referring to a long time period, perhaps covering 5,000 years, how India evolved. And there was a very clear sequence to the unfolding. And just like individual soul is evolving, so the group soul, the soul of the nation, is also evolving. And I haven't come across anyone other than Sri Aurobindo who maps this evolution in detail. And we can find three different models in Sri Aurobindo's teachings. The simplest one is three-stage process, where he is talking about the vital stage, the earlier stage, and then moving on to the mental stage, and third, the spiritual stage. The third has never happened on earth. It is yet to happen. And collectively, we are at the mental stage of development. There is another model of social development that he is referring to in this book, The Cycle of Society, Cycle of Social Development, where the symbolic age, the typal age, the conventional age, and then the age of reason, subjective age, spiritual age. So we are currently into subjective age. The age of reason is coming to an end, entering into subjective age, spiritual is yet to come. I'm not going into the symbolic, typal, conventional, because that is not the framework I will be using today. The third model Sri Aurobindo brings, that is where you see the chakras in the human body. That is used as a framework to understand the evolution of a whole collective, a culture, that how does it evolve, regardless of the changing boundaries. So in this 5,000 years, the boundaries of India, political boundaries, have continuously changed. Different empires have come and gone. What we have generally as history of India is the recording of the political empires lineages coming and going, the Maurya Empire, the Gupta Empire, and all that coming and going. And what is the underlying connecting thread is not captured. So if we don't see that underlying evolutionary process, this rise and fall of empires and change of the political nation states and boundaries, they will not make sense. They look like random processes. But Sri Aurobindo shows a very clear development that can be traced, that can be mapped. And I saw the reference to it in one of his letters in the book Letters on Yoga, where he is referring to supramental manifestation. And in one of the letters he says, the spiritual history of India, where he briefly touches, saying that the earliest stage in India was an age of intuition. Intuition came first. That was before the age of reason. The mental development took place anywhere in the world. It was age of intuition, the Vedic period. And from then onwards, it was a descending movement. This is where he maps the descending movement. And then he starts with how it goes down from center to center, all the way to the Mooladhara. And there is a clear sequential development to that journey. And all the civilizational cycles, the empire building cycles, they were corresponding to this movement downward. So what happened was, during the Vedic period, there was an ascension that took place. A small group of people, the rishis, who ascended, directly coming in touch with their soul and rising up to the planes of intuition. According to Sri Aurobindo's model of consciousness, the planes of intuition are above. So they rose up into a higher levels and established something profound. They had discovered supermind, the sun world. But very fascinating part is, he says, even this was a rapid recapturing of a previous cycle that is no more accessible to us. There was a global civilization which disappeared. And he even refers to a common language for humanity. And that civilization, we do not have any records. Some glimpses here and there. That civilization ended, and out of that there were two branches, the Chaldean tradition and the Vedic tradition. Two branches out of which the Vedic continued, the Vedic retained. The Vedic branch was the one that rapidly recaptured the essence of the previous cycle. And they re-established. So in the Vedas, when we study, we can see them referring to their ancient seers, Purvebhi Rishi Birityo. So the Vedic rishis were a small group of people who rapidly recovered an ancient knowledge. And this itself was a profound work. And again, this was a mystical period in development. Age of reason had not yet come. So at least 4,000 to 5,000 years, that's the period where this is happening. Or I have not yet succeeded in actually mapping on whether the Indus Valley civilization and the Vedic civilization is one and the same, or was the Indus Valley civilization part of the larger, earlier global civilization. We do not have sufficient evidence to say it. So in India, you will find a great deal of debates happening about the timing of the Vedic civilization. But regardless of the timing, what is important for us is the sequence of development. That is the crucial part, not exactly the particular period where it happened, because there is a certain linear development. So according to Sri Aurobindo, that Chaldean tradition collapsed. It was more in the direction of occult knowledge, and that civilization also fell apart. But Vedic branch was primarily spiritual. The occult knowledge was there. And this is when the soul of India, the current Indian civilization, and the soul of it, the childhood of it, formed. Where just like children, many children, not all, do have a direct touch with their soul very early on. And they have not yet lost the touch. But they gradually lose it when the mind develops. The external instrumentation develops and becomes more and more complex. So something similar happened to Indian civilization. During the childhood of Indian civilization was this discovery, the truth in the heart, the Agni in the heart, and ascending with the power of that ascending force of Agni, the flame of aspiration. They discovered the plane after plane, and they discovered the ocean above, ocean, the subconscious ocean below, and in between the human life. And the entire Vedic imagery, the mantric imagery, captures that journey of discovery. So they already discovered the divine consciousness that is behind the apparent visible nature. And they mapped it meticulously. They used different vocabulary. We can see it in the, say, Gayatri mantra, Bhur Bhuva Swa. That is, in modern contemporary language, Sri Aurobindo's language, the physical world, the vital world, the mental world. And beyond that, they saw the Satyam, Mridam, Brihat. And beyond that, there was Mayas. That was their term for the Ananda plane. So they mapped these planes already long ago and encoded it in their Vedic vocabulary. And that was directly through the process of intuition. And their method of self-discovery was, in today's India, it is misunderstood. It is referred to as the rituals of yajna. That came later. The original Vedic rishis, it was psycho-spiritual process of connecting to the profound aspiration, not only within oneself, it is there what is making a plant to grow, a tree to grow out of this material nature. There is something that is growing, there is a power that is ascending towards light. And they could connect with that light, that force. And they gave it the term Agni. And Agni was the mediating power that carried them forward. And there was this ascending force, and then there was this descending force which they refer to as the Indra. If Agni is the force instinct with knowledge, it has intuitive knowledge. There is something in us has an intuitive knowledge, something that wants to grow towards truth, towards goodness, towards beauty. And that is human aspiration. And it is not human aspiration, it is Earth's aspiration. It is there in nature. And they connected to that universal force. And when you open to it, it will carry you forward. And there is a response, a universal response that descending force come in as a flash of intuition, and the higher ranges of mind begins to operate. And as they became receptive, then this force started descending into them. And that was the process of transformation. This ascending force that is instinct with knowledge, and there is a descending light and force, knowledge instinct with force. So Indra was not only light and knowledge, but it was also power that made the change. So between these two, ascending and descending movement was their whole process, with which they ascended and also they descended into the subconscious and subconscient and rediscovered the lost sun. That was their imagery, the divine consciousness in the material nature. So that discovery was already done, mapping was already done, process was already discovered. But then over centuries and millennia, this knowledge started fading away. So one possibility, if we consider that if 1500 BC or beyond that, if I'm just assuming, if the Indus Valley civilization was a global, part of a global civilization, and then the dispersion happened from all the cities had to be abandoned, then there was smaller groups, smaller kingdoms and formations that were happening. And if that is the Vedic period, if that is the case, I'm not saying that is what it is, but it is a possibility. And then there was loss of that knowledge over a period of time. Here again, we get help from Sri Aurobindo, where he says, all knowledge, when it is given form, they tend to fossilize. So original Vedic knowledge started getting fossilized. They were also discovering powers in nature and converting that into technology. And their technology was yajna, where it was based on system of correspondence. Say you have a small yajna kunda, the altar, where you're offering different materials and at specific timings, and it has a cosmic consequence. The act is small, but it has a cosmic consequence. And that is a very different type of technology than what we know today. This is technology, not linear causation, but non-linear causation. Then technology became more and more central, and the yajnas became more and more predominant. The original knowledge was fading away. And that is when the Upanishadic rishis, the second cycle, rose up. Pioneers like Yajnavalkya, who was a radical at that time, the court of Janaka, and there was a whole clan of rishis who took up the ancient method of directly going into inward discovery and ascending into the higher planes. They repeated the process, but with a different mindset than the Vedic rishis. For the Vedic rishis, it was much simpler. They were like childhood of the humanity. The mind was not yet formed. By the time the Upanishadic rishis were coming, the mind was beginning to form. So we see the Upanishads have very systematic classification of the planes and the different states of consciousness. So there was an excellent structure which we don't easily find in the Vedas. Vedas are more mystical. Upanishadic style is quite different. So there was multiple branches in that Upanishadic period. There was Brahmanas. They tried to preserve the Vedic rituals. and to decode each element of the ritual, what it meant, what is the significance, what is the consequence. They try to preserve the form. And Upanishads went into the original knowledge. Imagine if our current day scientists are gone, suddenly wiped out, and we have profound technologies, and then set of people trying to reverse engineer and try to decode the knowledge that was behind. So the Upanishadic rishis were deconstructing and reverse engineering the Vedas, but they always referred back to the Vedas, saying that Sa evam Veda, Vedas say so. So they were rediscovering the Vedic knowledge, restating and giving it a whole new form. And that is a time when smaller kingdoms were clustering into larger and larger kingdoms. And Sri Aurobindo also gives the political development, how the Indian polity developed. But for us, the political development is not important. It is the development of consciousness. The Upanishadic rishis were the bridge between the mystical Vedic period and the age of reason that was about to unfold across the world. They were the bridge. Such a bridge was missing in other civilizations. For example, Greek civilization. When the age of reason dawned upon earth, in India there was all the Patanjalis, Paninis, Buddha, all this explosion of profound, deep intellectual knowledge. And in Greece there was Aristotle, Plato, and that whole clan of profound philosophers, and in China, Lao Tzu, and many others. So prior to this was the Upanishadic seers making the bridge between the mystical and just sufficient intellectual foundation to build on the age of reason in India. So by the time of Upanishads, we already see a linguistic science developing deeply. People like Yaska, who compiled all the vocabulary that was available at that time. And he said around 400 words, they don't know the meaning. The original Vedic tradition, they don't know the meaning. Then Panini was reconstructing the language, purifying the language, and created the Paninian grammar and called it Sanskrit. And Sri Aurobindo says that's still a skeleton. The original being living language was much before the Vedic language, and he referred to that as the Deva Bhasha. And the first Rik of the Rig Veda, he says, is written in the Deva Bhasha, where the artha and shabda, the meaning and the sound, are not separate. And it is when the age of reason came, the mind and the meaning took on a separate journey. Prior to that, sound and meaning lived together with its creative force. So for the Vedic rishis, word was the ultimate creative power, the utterance that could create, that could transform, and that could build nations. So even the kings were really of great reverence to the rishis, because their word can make or break a nation. So they had the true spiritual power. They were really the ones who set the mold of Indian civilization. And Upanishadic rishis rediscovered and restated the knowledge. And Sri Aurobindo refers to that period as the youth. So from the childhood, it is becoming a youth. The Indian soul of the nation was developing. So we can almost consider this as a Sahasrara Chakra period. Vedic rishis were much into the age of intuition, that planes that were above. Then he says, from there onwards, in India what happened was consciousness was on a descending movement. It was taking up each layer of consciousness and lifting it up and spiritualizing it. So when the age of reason began in India, with all the Patanjalis, Paninis, and spirituality itself, Buddha, for example, the profound spiritualization of the mind took place. And that is also the time when the religion started taking birth, not only in India, everywhere else. So the profound philosophy started emerging, but they were spiritualizing the mind. But at the same time, profound rational intelligence was developing in India. And the linguistic development was happening. And it came down further. And that's the time when all the codification started. Physical mind codifying everything, systematizing everything. So that period corresponds to the Mauryan Empire. Mauryan Empire was a period where profound intellectual knowledge was unfolding and foundations were laid. And that period Sri Aurobindo refers to as again, that youth was coming into the manhood, and the nation was, the power, the intellectual culture of India was also spreading into the northwest Indian region, Afghanistan and other regions. The Mauryan Empire, Ashoka was instrumental in taking it across the world in that Asian countries. So there was this profound intellectual development that took place. And what happened corresponding period in Greece is there was intellectual development, but that cycle couldn't sustain long. The Greek flowering was short-lived. The Roman Empire came. And Roman Empire was not so much intellectual in its nature. There was vital practicality. So the cycles were short-lived, whereas in India, that cycle never broke. They continued. And what happened in India was, as the consciousness was coming down, after spiritualizing, the profound philosophies, everything was spreading all over. But it was leading towards the formation of universities, typically. The intellectual culture leads to universities. So those centers of learning, academic learning, intellectual learning, profound grammatical understanding, human psychology, all that were emerging. Masses were still not part of it. And it was still intellectual elite that was leading the journey. And that's when the consciousness was further coming down after 2000 into the heart center. And meanwhile, already the epics, all that had come. So the Vedic period, keyword was yajna. And in the Upanishadic period, the keyword was Brahman. And during the intellectual age, the keyword was dharma. What is the dharma of a king? That was their fundamental question. The empires were getting built. So Sri Aurobindo refers to 4 cycles of kingdoms coming together and forming larger empires. And the 5th attempt to form the largest empire was Mahabharata. The war, Mahabharata, is partly historical, and it is based on historical events. Mahabharata was composed. But this was already coming into the age of reason, but the story was happening much earlier. And so the dharma of the king and dharma of each one and the laws of dharma and re-establishing dharma, all that came into the picture. So by this time, already 3 different stages of synthesis took place. First was the integral knowledge of the Vedic rishis, then the laws of that knowledge, then the Upanishadic rishis rediscovering that knowledge and giving it a new form. Then further, the Gita takes up and synthesizes it further. By the time Gita came, there was already Sankhya and Yoga and various branching happened. When the intellect started analyzing everything, there was 6 different schools of philosophy, each one claiming to be complete in itself. So Sri Aurobindo says the original integral approach of the Vedic and Upanishadic rishis got splintered into 6 different schools. And each one claiming to be complete in itself. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra was one of the branches of that original. There were 6 systems. And then typically again the knowledge begins to fossilize, harden, and become very rigid customs. So codification starts and mechanization starts. So, and then the consciousness by the time was coming down to the heart center. That's when the bhakti movement began to arise. And it was also arising in kind of a revolt towards excessive intellectualization that was taking place. And the exemplary typal figure of that period is Kalidasa. Kalidasa is the romantic poet of period, Gupta Empire. And this is the period where arts, music, everything flourished, the 64 arts, and there was the golden age of India, where India did not reject the reason. And this is another typical quality of Indian civilization. It is a synthesizing civilization. So the Vedic knowledge was never totally rejected. It just went behind the scene like a foundational layer. Then on the top of it was Upanishadic layer. Then on the top of it was the intellectual layer. And now they were laying the emotional, aesthetic layer on the top of the profound intellectual understanding, profound spiritual understanding. And so they created this rich art and culture and opulence in India. And this is when the masses were brought in. Already we see the Mahabharata and Ramayana was a way of reaching out to the masses. The Upanishads, Vedas were inaccessible. Vedas were encoded. Only those who had the capacity to decrypt the Vedas could access it. And that decryption can be done only when you expand your consciousness. It cannot be done intellectually. So, and the Upanishadic rishis were much more closer to the intellectual form. So it was much more easy. So in Upanishad we see already Annamayam, Pranamayam, Manomayam, Vijnanamaya, Anandamaya. All that classification was very well structured, and Jagrat, Swapna, Sushupti, Turiya classification, these were all very well classified, very well organized. And from there was an outburst of intellectual growth. And then it was getting classified into dharma of every clan, dharma of every class, dharma of every particular grouping. So we will come across things like Swadharma, Kuladharma, Yugadharma, Sanadhana Dharma, Dharma. So all that detailed understanding, classification, all that. It is upon that foundation, this flourishing that happened, and Mahabharata and Ramayana became the vehicles of reaching out to the masses. And then the explosion of poetry and literature, and the emergence of temples, which was different from universities. On the one hand, there is Nalanda, all these universities were attracting thousands and thousands of people from all over Asia. The temple culture emerged to enable the masses to connect through emotions to the divine. So in the Vedic period, there were no temples, no universities. It was direct connection with the gods. So there you see the direct conversations with the gods. It was very intimate and close to them, very real to them. And Upanishadic period, it is very tapasic, very concentration, intense tapasya was their key, to enter. So we will see the teaching method in the Upanishads like Bhrigu, well, the Taittiriya Upanishad, where father will tell his son, when son goes to father and asks, teach me about Brahman, and he will say, Annam, Pranam, Chakshu, Shrotram, Mano, Vacham, Iti. The food, breath, hearing, seeing, manas, and speech. These 6 things. And then the son goes meditating on these 6 keywords, and he's building realization after realization. Tapasya, on one word, annam. If you take annam, food, and do deep tapasya on it, then you realize world is nothing but food chain. So, annam brahme divyajanad. So son come back to father and say, I discovered that the world is nothing but food. Everything is born out of food, sustained by food, returns to food. And father says, no, you go deeper. And all the way he reaches the Anandamaya. Then father says, now you know everything is born out of delight, sustained by delight, returns to delight. But that dimension of delight was gradually getting lost when the intellectual development was happening. And when the arts flourished during Gupta period and the temples came, so the aesthetics, beauty, arts, they were flourishing, and the temples were the places of worship. This is the most psychic period where the godheads were already reformed. The original Vedic Vishnu and Rudra and Brahmanaspati became the Trimurtis of Puranic period of Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, but of a different nature than the original Vedic gods. And so there was always a recasting of the form. And this is very important. Sri Aurobindo says, as this transition happens, the old molds are to be broken, and the essence is to be taken, and it is to be given a new form corresponding to the particular stage of evolution and growth of the society. So the Puranas are not at all rational. Their sense of time is very, very different. It is psychic world, symbolic world. The whole language is symbolic, and poetry is very, very different. And bhakti is the underlying movement. And they also puts everything into the story. The entire evolutionary story of Vishnu's 10 avatars, all that became the story with which the masses were educated, with the divinity seated in the heart and its evolution and the stories, storytelling, art forms everywhere in India. So this reached everywhere. And that is also the period where Buddhism started fading away from India. Buddhism stayed with intellectual development increasingly. They couldn't take up this devotional fervor with which Indian civilization went into the heart and explored and brought out the devotional poetry and the devotional development across India. And one thing to be remembered is the intellectual layer continued. Various philosophers were continuously emerging, and when the devotional development emerged, the various periods, like all the way to Kabir and Mirabai and later Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, all that was a continuous development that was taking place. So then from the Bhakti period came further descent into the solar plexus. That is when the Tantra flourished, the Shakti came into the picture. So from Yajna to the Brahman, to Dharma, to Bhakti, now it is Shakti. And so this is the time when the powers of nature was meticulously mapped. And this is also the time when Indian mathematics reached its peak. So what you see as yantras, these are profound mathematical encoding of universal cosmic structures, rhythms of unfolding, and the deities behind them. So they mapped meticulously all the bija mantras, the geometric forms, yantras, and this is also the time when the massive temple architecture began to come up. The power dimension in India was expanding. And this is also the time when India expanded all the way to Cambodia and the Southeast Asian countries, all the big temples in Southeast Asia, based on yantras. And all the stories of the mythology of the churning of the ocean and Vishnu's avatars, and all this you will find everywhere. And the scientific framework was Tantra. And all the religions accepted it. So the Buddhism accepted Tantra. There's a Buddhist branch of Tantra. Hinduism has its tantric side. Jainism has its tantric side. Tantra was the language that spread. It was superior technology or mastery over forces of nature, profound occult knowledge. And so the massive temple architecture in India, or the Brihadeshwara temple and all those massive constructions. So temple architecture had already begun during Gupta period, but relatively smaller temples. But then it was getting bigger, and then the larger kingdoms were, these temples were the ones that established the power field of the kingdoms and protected the nations. And the kings were investing heavily in this massive architecture. This was like in today's world, it's like, technologies that protected the nations. And then we see further going downward into the sensual dimensions. Tantra went down into exploring the sensuality. So in India, there was proliferation of the exploration of the sensuality. Even the bhakti movement started going into the sensual dimension, the sensual relationship with the divine. And but all this were done with utmost refinement. There was no crudity in it. In a very refined way, they explored all these dimensions going into sensuality, the spiritualizing the senses. So Kalidasa had already brought the aesthetic refinement into it. So that work was already done. Civilization was refined to take up sensuality and refine it further. And so already the descending movement is reaching, so it's already, we can say, the 8th to 10th century AD. This is already reaching its peak. And further, the consciousness was about to enter into the Mooladhara, that is the physical consciousness. And that is when, based on the chakras were codified during the Tantric period. We will not find any reference to it in the Vedas, in the Upanishads, in the Gita. We will not find reference to chakras. It is the Tantric period that map this entire subtle physical structures and subtle bodies, a scientific mapping of everything. The seeds of it was already there. For example, the Shiva Shakti. In the Vedas, it is referred to as Nr and Nri, but it was like a seed. Tantric period, it was developed into a full-fledged system of knowledge. Very different from everything else that preceded, and very powerful in its practical ability, application. Then came the sensuality, and also with it come certain corruptions. And then the consciousness was entering into the physical consciousness. And this is when the Hatha Yoga began. How to divinize the body. So till then was divinization and lifting up of the intellect and the mind, mental layers, then turning the emotions towards the divine and refining it, then turning the vital and turning it towards the divine and refining it, and then turning the sensuality towards the divine and refining it. Now, the body. So, how to divinize the body? This was the biggest challenge they faced. And so they developed elaborate systems of Hatha Yogic practices. And often these days when we say yoga, we are referring to Hatha Yoga. When we look at Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, there is no reference to asanas in it other than Sthiram Sukham Asanam, your comfortable posture. Whereas Hatha Yoga was looking at working with the subtle energy points and making the body a bridge to connect with the spirit and divinize the body. So the longevity of the body, the health of the body, they worked extensively on how to extend the lifespan of an individual and how to keep you sound and healthy for extended periods of time. And the siddhi in the body of longevity and lightness of the body and the ability to even fly in the subtle dimension. So they were exploring the physical body and its possibilities, pushing the limits. This is also the time when philosophically, intellectual layer was already working behind the scene. So for every corresponding period, there were philosophers who were providing the philosophies to the corresponding development. During this period, the period of the mukti, the liberation, the world as an illusion, all this were beginning to take influence the civilization. And on the top of it, the physical consciousness, as you go down, it is the field of tamas, deep tamas. If the mind is of sattvic nature, vital is of rajasic nature, the physical is tamasic. So the pioneers were diving into the deep tamas to transform it. But it is also the time when the tamas was settling over the civilization with its sleep state and dream state. The world is nothing but an illusion. It is not real. And that's a time when the invasion started coming to India. The Islamic invasion, and India was progressively falling asleep. But the intellectual cycle in India continued, and intellectual rigor and capacity continued till 1500 AD. We will see the mathematics, like School of Mathematics, Kerala School of Mathematics, it was happening much later. So there was a continuity that was happening, but it was becoming more and more isolated pockets. As a civilization, it was becoming more and more conservative because the invasions were coming and civilization was turning more and more inward. Liberation became the purpose of life, not necessarily the mastery. And civilization entered into a deep tamasic stage, which eventually culminated in the invasion by the British. And here again, interesting part is the European civilization mastered the physical. They went into the physical nature, mastered the forces of physical nature, and came and bulldozed India. And the steamroller, Sri Aurobindo uses the word steamroller, and out of that, Tamas India was waking up. Sri Aurobindo says the Hatha Yogins, the method they used was insufficient to divinize human body. It was still a mechanical, laborious process. And it took all your time, and you had to withdraw from the mainstream society, dedicate all your time to prepare your body through the asanas and kriyas and processes to keep it lasting centuries, but you don't have time to get back to the society and contribute to the society. On the top of it, this is an isolated siddhi, not a power that gets established in the nature. And the method was mechanical, not the characteristic power of the spirit in matter. So that was their failure. And he said it will not be possible to transform the physical body, divinize the body, without having the characteristic power of the spirit in matter. And this is where supermind comes into the picture. Where in his mapping, so he went all the way from that tamasic India waking up, and he was mapping all the way to the Vedic rishis and mapped everything. And he did his own exploration all the way to the down to the subconscient transformation of the physical body. That's where he hit upon the limitations of the methods. And he realized only the supramental force can transform the physical substance, the physical body. And so that whole evolutionary nature. So he said this is the spiritual mission of India. And this divinization of individual and collective, layer by layer, all the way to eventually matter itself getting divinized. That is the mission of the nation. It was already set by the Vedic rishis. And it was a matter of unfolding it. And many cycles came and went, many empires came and went. But this mission continued. And every time recasting itself into new forms of knowledge. So the last form was the Hatha Yogic form that we inherited. But Hatha Yogic approach includes the Tantric chakra knowledge behind it, preceding the Puranic knowledge behind it, preceding the Gita behind it, the Upanishad behind it, the Vedic layer behind it. And now is the time when globally the scientific discoveries digging deep into matter is discovering the powers of nature and trying to master those powers of nature and trying to conquer the world. And it won't work because, he says, first of all, the instrument with which we are trying to do it is very limited. So when the modern scientists are trying to reach to the ultimate reality through the power of intellect, there is profound confrontation with the powers of the universe. And this is what Sri Aurobindo illustrates when he started writing in 1914 the Arya series, when he was writing for the global audience. The first essay on the secret of the Veda, it is about the colloquy of Indra and Agastya. Agastya was a representative rishi who, with the power of thought, referred to as a Maruts, was trying to reach the highest. And the Indra, the master of the divine mind, opposes him. And major battle takes place. And Agastya asking Indra, why are you stopping me? Maruts are your brothers. I am your brother. Why are you stopping me? Then Indra says, you have to work under me if you want to go beyond. And then Agastya understood and surrenders to Indra, and then they march together to the higher planes. What it means for us is the present civilization, with its profound intellectual development, is trying to reach the highest, finest, but it cannot. So there is a massive breakdown. Powers of nature are all in undressed everywhere. And this cannot be dealt with mind, which is fragmented in its nature. We have to open to Indra, or the higher consciousness and powers of intuition, a higher and vaster, deeper being, which can embrace this and harmonize the issue. So Sri Aurobindo says the integral yoga is a culmination of this entire process that had been unfolding over 4,000 to 5,000 years. And eventually matter and the spirit coming together. And the divinization of the body, this is really the next stage in human evolution. That will be also a global civilization, and India has to play a role in it, because this is where this experiment has successfully continued. Everywhere else it broke off. In Europe, for example, after the Greek cycle, then the Roman cycle came, and that also short-lived. They rapidly entered into the sensual and disintegrated completely and fell into the dark ages for a long period of time. And then when the science came, there is a tendency to reject reactionary nature. So there was a rejection of all the past, trying to build everything fresh, which is very different from India's approach, where India synthesizes every layer. When India is building a new layer, it is never rejection of the entire past. It breaks the mold, but takes the essence. And this is the work for India. And we need to understand the entire process, break the molds, take the essence, and give it new forms. to solve contemporary problems of the world. And that is the work and mission that is upon India. And that's the future that is ahead of us. And there is a profound work to be done. And a place like Auroville is a lab set for that purpose, to solve contemporary problems by rediscovering the ancient knowledge and giving it new forms. So Matri Mandir, for example, it doesn't resemble any temples. And yet it is a mandir. We call it mandir. Purely the direct approach of consciousness. So there is the whole city to be built from that new perspective, and transformation of human nature to be done from that perspective. We need to keep the entire historic journey and the picture in mind when we are dealing with the present. So now we can take up any question sharings.
Thank you, Manoj. Thanks for running through this brief history of India in an hour. First, I would like to ask a few questions I have of my own, and I would also request those who have questions to come here and ask you directly. First is, the topic says spiritual evolution of India. How do we not fall into the trap of ritual evolution of India? You know, it's a fine line. How do you think we can avoid it? Because it's whatever we think, not we as in the majority, the ritual is taken for spiritual. That's one thing. And you said a very beautiful phrase called civilization of synthesis, India being a civilization of synthesis. And you referred to ascension and the descension, which is a vertical movement. Then there is also a horizontal movement, which is the east versus west. There is always this pull and push. And it seems the three periods that you said, India coming from the Vedic, Upanishadic, and then the present times, traversing mind, vital, and the physical. Will it be wrong to say that the West, in fact, went the opposite way, where they started off with the physical, and then slowly they have entered a mind phase, say in the last 200 years. And we are at a very interesting period where we both are looking forward, and that's where the synthesis is a necessity. Your thoughts on it?
About the rituals, yes, there is a tendency to revive the past forms without understanding the spirit behind things. And there is a danger of becoming too strict with these forms of rituals. Though many of the Vedic rituals, not ritual, they are profound technologies. It has impact. The tantric technologies, they have impact. What is required is to understand the science behind it and recast and create new rituals. Like, for example, we sit in the amphitheater with a fire. It's a new ritual. Yeah. Similarly, so we need to create contemporary ritual. Ritual has a powerful role in transformation, but we need to understand the essence and recast into new forms. Just like Matri Mandir is a recast form of an old way of approaching the divine. Now, coming to the second question, it is not true to say that the West is beginning from the material. In the West too, it's a global movement that took place, but what happened in the West is disruption. Things got broken. So the continuity was not there. In the present civilizational cycle, what is happening is what developed in India, the center of that profound growth shifted later to the Arab countries, and from there was a huge development of Islamic expansion that took place, and from there it shifted to Europe, and that's where it really picked up the material and recalibrating the whole knowledge about matter. But it is yet to come in terms with the spirit. So the bridging science and spirituality will be a key. These two models of knowledge, they have two different models of knowledge, two different approach to knowledge. So the yogic methodology of knowing is very different from scientific methodology of knowing. So it's often I find people saying Vedas are scientific, Upanishads are scientific. It's false. It is downgrading the Vedas. Vedic approach or a yogic approach is fundamentally different. It is knowledge by identity. It's not knowledge by an objectified thing that you're analyzing. So there is a revolution that is required in the scientific methodology of knowing. That will yield new body of scientific knowledge that can bridge the spiritual knowledge. And if this is to be done, this is one area where I would consider India has to play a key role, where the ability to combine science and yogic knowledge method, that can birth a body of knowledge that can be the bridge between the spiritual and the material. That will be the future.
Well, I was referring to Sri Aurobindo's first dream, where he says, India today is free, but she has not achieved unity. And here he specifically refers to, but the old communal division into Hindus and Muslims seems now to have hardened into a permanent political division. So this is where I was referring to East versus West, where Brahmanic versus Abrahamic, so to speak, are at clash. And in a way, it gives a great opportunity for India to find synthesis. So he also declares in almost in a very certain form that the partition must go. He says that division must go by whatever means, in whatever way. So what is the, how do we ensure or make sure that happens if we have to take a spiritual pathway?
So it is already happening. Like India is now rising in the world. Within this decade, India is expected to be the third largest economy in the world, but it is still the vital power. The intellectual power of India is yet to emerge. An intellectual power that is informed and illumined by the spiritual power. And India is already pioneering many things. If you look at the way India built India's digital public infrastructure, it is an application of ancient spiritual wisdom. Maybe I will have to explain this a little bit to you. One foundational knowledge of India is unity and diversity can coexist. Now, this is a very important detail. In today's world, age of reason is reaching a culmination. And Sri Aurobindo says age of reason will eventually lead towards a mechanical state, because the reason itself is a machine. So it will create a standardized perfection. And it is already happening. Every individual is a data point and tracked, and behavior is manufactured, perceptions are manufactured. And in the US model, it is the corporate surveillance that is emerging. In the Chinese model, it is the state surveillance that is emerging. Citizens are being tracked. India is the first nation to come up with the idea of data democracy, and also the way India has built its infrastructure is to prevent monopolies, corporate monopolies. For example, like Aadhaar and UPI was a revolutionary foundation upon which the entire India got connected. Now, upon this foundation, no monopolies can emerge. So India created a layer called Beacon Protocol. It is like a decentralized technology that cannot be owned by any single entity. A distributed system that is interoperable, but it provides a unifying framework upon which diversity can thrive. And this is done by leading technology people like Nandan Nilekani, Pramod Verma, Infosys founders and heads. So this is an application of technology as providing a solution to the contemporary challenges that prevents monopoly of corporate monopoly nor the state monopoly. providing level playing ground to the people. And this is the way India is solving, and this is now spreading. So India's digital public infrastructure model is now getting copied by other nations. If you look at the way the latest visit to US by the Prime Minister and their signing of the contracts, these things play a very key role. Other nations are recognizing that India has made path-breaking work. And as the nations are becoming more and more woven into each other, practically war become more and more difficult because your economic life is dependent on each other. So political boundaries become less and less critical. It still has a life some more time, but it really is losing its power. And I would say the India-Pakistan issue, all this will automatically get resolved when India take its stand and lead. And India is already beginning to do that. And once the intellectual capacity of India also rises, this is still lagging behind. India, still a large population is still hardly colonized. So their mindset still need to be resetted, to be changed so that this can emerge. But it is a matter of time. The movement is already in place. Since economic life is more and more woven, merging of these things will be a matter of time. And India will be leading in that.
Thank you, Manoj, for such a beautiful summary of the entire spiritual development of India. And there is one part that you referred to which I often wonder about. If we look at the movement of evolution, the billions and millions of years of evolution of the earth, we see slowly there is movement towards complexity and there is refining of matter. So in the pre-Vedic, pre-Upanishadic period, humans were even, in the Stone Age, living in the caves and stuff. And then I wonder how come a wandering tribe arrive, and then there is this sudden, it seems like an aberration in the evolution, that suddenly there is this like a bright spark, it looks like that, where there is this, like you said, there is this phase of intuition, which leads to development of phase of intellectual. So I'm wondering, it feels like, and then that led on to other divinizations of different, as you mentioned. So it feels like a U-turn almost to me, that how in such a dense development or evolution that's going on, suddenly there is this spark, which is intuition. How does that happen and how did it develop like that?
I touched upon it in the beginning of the session. Sri Aurobindo says even that Vedic glory, that sudden rising, it was a rapid recapturing from a previous cycle. Both Sri Aurobindo and Mother refers to a global civilization that is preceding, pre-Vedic, of which we do not know much. And Mother refers to many attempts in the past, which is aborted. So what we refer to as history is a very small period of time. So what we see as the Vedic bright spot, it was a recapturing from a previous cycle, a rapid reascension. And since the intellectual capacity is there already in humanity, that's why when children who are from a very backward communities, when they get exposure, they rapidly develop because it is already there. So what we carry within us as treasures, it is not limited to the known part of history. There are cycles that are lost and we have no idea.
So we do not know about that period, but it is our understanding that it was a recapture of a period.
Recapture, and even today we can rapidly recapture because all these are still available. These layers exist. And this is the truth. Vedic rishis were talking about the forefathers helping the progeny. So they are still there. Even now one can access their help.
And one follow-up question on that. So as we see in the movement of evolution, as evolution moves from one to the next stage, it's almost a movement towards perfection. So does it mean, if you're saying that there is a movement from intellectual to more heart center to more towards the solar plexus, does it mean that those have been perfected and hence the movement is going forward? Or
no, we cannot say perfected. These were all taken up and attempted. The refining of the work was done in small scale. Prototyping has been done in India. So there is a whole body of knowledge that is available in every layer.
Right.
So we need to rediscover that knowledge, repackage it, share it.
So there'll be cycles of those evolution which will be repeating themselves.
Right. In different cultures, different parts of being are developed.
Right.
So accordingly, they would be drawn to certain parts of the being and certain types of methods. So when Sri Aurobindo is writing about national education, he was not writing about India's national education. He is talking about terrestrial global education, education for the nations. The community of nations coming together, and each community of each nation having its own unique soul and unique temperament, specific learning requirement. So Auroville's international zone is to represent all that.
Yes.
So there is a national education required depending upon the cultural context and the parts of being that are already developed and the parts that require development.
Thanks. And then there is one last one. It was very interesting when you said that India kind of went into the tamasic phase, no, exploring the physical. And then you mentioned that the West had actually mastered it, right? And then there was this period. And also you mentioned another point that the physical can be mastered only by opening up to the supermind.
Transformed.
Transformed. So now my question is regarding this mastering of the physical that was done, let's say, in the West or certain other parts of the world, and the transformation that will happen by opening up to the supermind. So what is the connection between?
We cannot say mastered. Modern science has not mastered. Some smaller aspects of nature has been mastered, but it is already a mess. Like when you try to tinker with one thing,
Yes.
there is something else going wrong.
And we can see where we are today.
So it is a non-linear thing. The reality is one thing. So if you tinker something here, there is another consequence somewhere else, which cannot be figured out by the mind. Science is beginning to recognize that. So it requires a different way of being and way of knowing from there to play with it. Otherwise, right now we are modifying genetic code, for example. Genetic codes emerged as a grand symphony of the whole nature. Now we are tinkering it in a local, small area. And what is the consequence of it in a larger system, life system? That is unpredictable and human mind cannot know. So we are playing with fire here and there is no mastery. So mastery can be brought in only when the supramental consciousness is established, and from there these aspects are taken up. Then technologies would look very different than what we have. So our current technologies are very, very crude. That's why there is so much pollution on Earth. It is extremely crude.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm told if we tinker too much with this timing now, it will have an effect somewhere else. So Manoj is available. We can have a conversation after this also. If you want to pose a very small question and Manoj can give a very small answer, we can go ahead.
It's a small question. I don't know if the answer is small. Because it was such a profound talk. I have long notes that I took on my phone, but my question is around what you galvanized us to at the end, which is to create new forms. That's what we have to do now. And then I think about the quote that you gave from Sri Aurobindo at the beginning, which, if I got it correctly, was, all knowledge, when they come to form, they begin to fossilize. So what can we keep in mind as we create new forms such to prevent fossilization. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is a fundamental problem of anything given form tends to harden. So in Buddhism, there is a term like a beginner's mind, how to stay fresh and young. So if when you are able to bring certain silence and peace and quietude inside and stay open, then the force is constantly crushing you and molding you and reshaping you. It will not allow you to fossilize. So opening to the divine Shakti will ensure that you won't fossilize. Because the nature, every leaf is unique, every fingerprint is unique, every moment is unique. So when we open to the divine nature, it will ensure freshness.
Thank you.
To ensure freshness, what we have also done is we have organized different talks every day, and we have invited different speakers to break our fossilized thoughts. I welcome you all tomorrow to a beautiful talk on the subject Renaissance in India. It will be in Savitri Bhavan at 3:30 p.m. I hope to see you all again. Thank you, Manoj. Thanks for the beautiful session. Hope to see you soon too. Thank you.